Thank you, Julie. It's an honor, great honor and privilege to be here and to speak with our group. And I will begin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu ve'ekimanu vehigianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has granted us life and sustained us and allowed us to arrive at this time. Because we are between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, reviewing our last year and looking ahead to our new year, both with trepidation and hope, excitement and concern, and because as a Jewish candidate for APA president-elect, I'm addressing a group of Jewish psychologists who are becoming increasingly alarmed by the rising violence in our country and around the world, concomitant with the rise in anti-Semitism internationally, as well as at home, I thought it appropriate to open our conversation today with the Shehechianu. As a young girl sitting at my grandmother's feet, I heard about the friendly, those slithery snakes, and the raucous pigs, the welcoming neighing of the horses, and the cool summer nights that my grandmother spent in the barn, sleeping in the hay with the animals. There were also the emergency visits to the doctor miles away by horse and carriage, and the frightening shouts of the men on horseback coming ever closer, threatening to burn the farms that provided a sharecropper's home and work for my grandmother's family and other Jewish families fortunate to have felt a stability in the Ukraine in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Soon enough, my great-grandfather in 1907 left his home and his family in Russia to build a new life for them in America. On November 11th, 1911, my grandmother, who was just then 13 years old, arrived at Ellis Island with her mother and 3 younger siblings, homesick for her rural life in Ukraine and anxious, but hopeful about the architecture of her future life as the family would soon reunite on the Lower East Side of New York City. From my grandmother and my grandfather, my mother and my father, and my large extended family, I learned about the Jewish ideals of a loving commitment to family and to social justice in our larger society. Rabbi Hillel's maxim, if you are not for yourself, who are you? If you are for yourself only, what are you? If not now, when? Was the foundation of who we were as Jews in 20th century America. After hearing about my uncle's work as a clinical psychologist, I determined at the age of 5 that I would become a clinical psychologist. As a college student at Princeton University, having become increasingly aware of the power of the courts and legislation in shaping human behavior, I aspired to combine a study of the law with my beloved science of psychology. In the first women's class of 1973 at Princeton, we demonstrated the importance of the social activist's voice. As the first woman to be president of a residential college, advocating for student rights and the larger community's use of our abundant campus resources, and as a summer intern for Congresswoman Bella Abzug, I was part of the women's movement and student movement that demanded social justice for all who are minoritized, marginalized, and targets of hatred and violence. In 1977, I created the Victim Witness Assistance Unit at the State Attorney's Office in Tallahassee, Florida, to assist violent crime victims and witnesses in the criminal justice system. In 1978, I co-founded and became the first board president of Refuge House, a shelter for women and children survivors of domestic violence. Today, both the Victim Witness Assistance Unit and Refuge House have significantly expanded their reach to serve annually scores of thousands of women, children, and men who are survivors of violent crimes. Throughout my career as a clinical psychologist in Chicago and nationally respected forensic psychologist, I've worked with domestic physical violence and sexual violence survivors and was a faculty lecturer for many years at the University of Chicago, the Rosalind Franklin University of Medicine and Science, the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology, and Northwestern University, teaching the courtroom role of the forensic psychologist. In the early 2000s, I became a national movement leader for prescriptive authority after having been elected president of Division 55 in 2004. I was then president of the Illinois Psychological Association in the 2010s and have led the successful legislative movement for Illinois Psychologists' Prescriptive Authority ever since. The Prescriptive Authority movement's mission is to provide care for our community's most vulnerable and underserved from a cadre of licensed prescribing psychologists representative of BIPOC, AAPI, LGBTQAI+, and disabled communities. My goal is to have more than 1,500 licensed prescribing psychologists in Illinois by 2041, thereby increasing access to the highest quality mental health care in Illinois by 100%. I am writing a book to be published by APA Press entitled The Revolution in Healthcare: How Prescribing Psychologists Are Changing the Landscape of Mental Health Care in the United States. Psychologists, because of our extraordinary education, training, and experience, have an impact every day on the lives of those who are suffering in our local and national international communities. I wholeheartedly support the critical work done by applied and clinical and academic psychologists, and I passionately believe in protecting clinical practice while seeking to expand practice to include prescriptive authority, integrated behavioral health in a variety of healthcare medical settings, telehealth durability, community mental health, population health, and a plethora of collaborative intersectional relationships among research scientists and scientist practitioners working on ways to achieve health equity and to dismantle systemic racism. My vision for the APA has 7 foundational pillars of action: identifying and disseminating the critical information specifically on evidence-based, evidence-informed treatments for the sequelae of COVID-19 and the substance abuse and addiction disorders, using our effective scientific evidence to contribute to the eradication of global health disparities, the dismantling of systemic racism and antisemitism, and the achievement of health equity, promoting global initiatives that will reduce the existential threats to our environment and will meet the challenges and needs of climate refugees, facilitating greater access to comprehensive integrative mental health care, including prescriptive authority, promoting clinical practice and working closely with SPTAs to ensure that they have the necessary tools to address developments in state legislatures that might erode the privacy rights of patients and or erode the psychotherapist privilege. I will ensure the financial viability of our APA-SI. Emphasizing the critical importance of scientists and psychological science, infused with EDI initiatives fulfilling our APA mission to impact our world. Providing for the continued growth of an inclusive APA that ensures multidisciplinary within our field of psychology, multicultural, multinational APA leadership with representation from all minoritized and marginalized communities, including BIPOC, Jewish, LGBTQAI+, AAPI, and disabled communities. As your president, I will walk courageously with you into our future. I will listen to you with respect and compassion and govern boldly. My outreach to all of our many communities will be collaborative, intersectional, with an emphasis on scientific evidence, bridge building, equity, diversity, inclusion, gender and sexual diversity, and working to unravel and solve our world's toughest challenges. I said of my father at his memorial service, this little boy who became the man with the twinkle in his eye, had the quiet dignity and wisdom and the respect of all who had the good fortune to meet him and the love of all who had the good fortune to know him. I hope that you will think the same of me. Many of you know that I am part of a small group of Jewish psychologists, including Esther Cole, Sarah Friedman, Lou Steinberg, Lenore Walker, and Susan Warshaw, who have been working as APA governance representatives, both past and present, with our APA staff and APA elected leadership to provide information about Jewish history, culture, lived experience, connections to Israel, religious observance, contemporary life, etc., and to address issues of anti-Semitism both within APA and in our larger community. Our group, plus other Jewish psychologists, including Lily Friedland, Eileen Serlin, and others, with Lenore in the lead, have written a brief history of global anti-Semitism, as well as having addressed anti-Semitism in APA. Our group has also formulated recommendations for APA and how we may confront anti-Semitism inside our organization, inside our discipline and in the larger community. I will review some of that history now and then talk about the recommended action steps, and then we'll have some Q&A, and I look forward to hearing directly from you. Historically, U.S. law classified Jews as white persons under the Naturalization Act of 1790, where they were considered among the free white persons who could become citizens. When U.S. laws later limited the number of immigrants from certain countries, Jews were targeted with quotas, but were still considered Caucasian. Unlike some Asian and African immigrants, Jews could become full citizens. However, they remained culturally different and thus not really white, especially during the peak periods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when anti-Semitism was rampant in the U.S., as well as throughout the rest of the world. Many Jews could be identified by the communities in which they lived, their different language, usually Yiddish, their own newspapers, and the holidays they celebrated. For many American Jews, we do not think of ourselves as members of a different race. Instead, we think in terms of whether we're Jewish or not Jewish. While we do not think that the construct of race applies to us, we understand that anti-Semitism affects all of us. Despite the education and economic successes of many Jews, it is obvious that anti-Semitism across the world is increasing. So too are the threats of annihilation of Israel, the country many Jews identify as a homeland and a barrier against another Holocaust that wiped out 6 million Jews just 75 years ago, when other countries, including the United States, refused them protective entry. According to a recent Pew Center survey, 53% of U.S. Jews feel less safe today than they did 5 years ago. Orthodox Jews, who can be readily identified by the religious garments they wear, report feeling even less safe. On the left side of the political spectrum, Jews are often described as having privilege, as part of a white majority establishment that has dominated and oppressed people of color. Yet we often identify with oppressed peoples around the world and have a long history of support of our American labor and civil rights movements. At the same time, fascist right-wing politicians refer to Jews as an impure race, recalling the Nazi designation of our having tainted the Aryan culture. Eric Goldstein, an associate professor of history at Emory University, has described, quote, Jewish identity in America as inherently paradoxical and contradictory. He writes, what you have is a group that was historically considered and considered itself an outsider group, a persecuted minority. In the space of 2 generations, they've become one of the most successful integrated groups in American society, by many accounts part of the establishment, and there's a lot of dissonance between these two positions. Eileen Serlin, I'm going to quote you here, you astutely noted, this is an ominous historical pattern. When we become successful, we become a threat. When we become a threat, we are attacked and murdered, and the survivors are forced to leave our adopted homes. The CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt, agrees that Jews have long demonstrated concern about racial equality. He talks about our being in the forefront of the American labor and civil rights movements. He also acknowledges the white privilege in Jewish people's lives. Jews aren't looked at twice when we walk into a store. We're not looked at twice by someone in uniform. That obviously isn't a privilege that people of color have the luxury of enjoying. Greenblatt goes on to say that even though light-skinned Jews may benefit from being perceived as white, Jewish identity is shaped by exogenous forces, ostracism, exile, and other forms of persecution, including the most egregious persecution, extermination. He says, quote, I think that there is this sense of shared struggle programmed into the DNA of the Jewish people. The new scientific field of epigenetics would support Greenblatt's assertions that the intergenerational trauma from the experienced and remembered history of the pogroms in Eastern Europe and then the Holocaust might have altered our genes. What we also know for certain is that second-generation American Jews cut our teeth on the vivid stories of the pogroms from our grandparents and World War II and the Holocaust from our parents and the popular American media of the 50s and 60s. While Eastern European Jews or Ashkenazi Jews are light-skinned, the Jews who escaped persecution and death in Arab lands or from the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century, often called Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, are dark-skinned. In Israel, the Sephardic Jews' music and foods are not European. In the United States, many Sephardic Jews have formed associations of Jews of color. Russia's war in Ukraine, whose president is openly Jewish and whose 3 uncles were murdered by the Nazis at Babi Yar, has reawakened fears of another imminent Holocaust. Violence against Jews is rising around the world. In the last several months, a mass shooting incident occurred at a Buffalo, New York supermarket, killing 13 Black Americans and injuring many others. The shooter had written a manifesto supporting, quote, racist replacement ideology that's touted by Fox Radio and television commentator Tucker Carlson. These quote-unquote great replacement conspiracy theories believed by many who espouse politically right-wing and fascist views claim that white people are being replaced by non-whites, thus justifying the killing of blacks and Jews in particular. This is not a singular incident. Replacement theory has been cited at political rallies with respect to the shooting of 23 people who were shopping in El Paso, Texas in 2019, in synagogues in 2020 and 2021, and in preschools. At the Unite the Right rally held in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017, film crews captured white supremacists memorably chanting, "Jews will not replace us," as they engaged in ever more aggressive hate speech. A newly released encyclopedia by the group RootSource, listing anti-Semitic incidents around the world in 1 year, is almost 800 pages long. The ADL, which keeps track of reports of anti-Semitism, produces graphs suggesting huge increases in anti-Semitic acts each year. Biased and ill-informed accounts of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts have also served to increase anti-Semitic incidents worldwide. During the conflicts in Gaza between May 10th and May 31st of 2021, the ADL received a 141% increase in reports of anti-Semitic incidents, including 211 cases of harassment, 71 cases of vandalism, and 15 assaults across the U.S. Nearly 40% of the total incidents included explicit references to Israel or Zionism. Some of these incidents included mocking Jewish school children, threatening and harassing phone calls to synagogues, grave desecration in cemeteries, and violent assaults against individuals who were visibly attired as Jewish people. Following the 2018 hate crime of the Tree of Life Synagogue, for example, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network published a guide talking to children about hate crimes and anti-Semitism. The guide highlighted the importance of addressing the response to this disaster in the public square. In 2021, the Anti-Defamation League investigated almost 10,000 such hate crimes. The consequences of social media postings that publicize disputed or clearly false information about conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians remains under study by the Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry at Tel Aviv University. Using meta-analysis of published studies, they found that anti-Semitism was higher when the boycott, disinvestment, sanction, BDS movement was being encouraged, especially when Israelis believed that their actions were unfairly targeted. Those who support BDS believe that by not supporting Israel, the government will change its policies toward the Palestinians. The fact that there are two sides to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, often played out around both people can coexist on the same land, is lost on many who engage in BDS rhetoric and who do not live in Israel or the Palestinian territories. So, what's the history of anti-Semitism in psychology? The history of anti-Semitism and psychology's role in its perpetration can be found in a number of published books and papers in both the United States and elsewhere, and my colleagues have reviewed that. A.S. Winston, in his 1998 article on E.G. Boring, described Boring's role in extending the belief that Jews as a group were born with specific defects. Boring, a professor and psychology department chair at Harvard from 1923 to 1953, apparently supported the careers of some of his students, despite their Jewishness, writing reference letters asserting that they did not have whatever objectionable traits that were ascribed to Jews during that period. Quotas on Jews at universities also served to prevent Jews from becoming part of the mainstream in psychology during that time. Although the issues of character and Jewishness are surely separable from a contemporary perspective, they were certainly conjoined in centuries-old anti-Semitic discourse characterizing Jews as wicked, perverse, false, aggressive, disloyal, traitorous, sinister, cowardly, unpatriotic, greedy, materialistic, money grubbers, clannish, ostentatious, unclean, and ill-mannered, or worse. These ascribed characteristics were commonly used to keep Jews from admission to, or even if they were successful graduates of, being hired by universities. We have not yet seen evidence that the APA did anything to denounce or try to stop this practice among its members. Although not solely tied to anti-Semitism, the Nazis and other advocates of racial purity made eugenics part of their anti-Jewish agenda. At least one psychologist is known to have aided the Nazis in the eugenics movement. Psychologist Rudolf Hippius became known for his work in, quote, racial psychology. Specifically, his study of, quote, the suitability of people of mixed German and Slav descent. In other words, a determination of whether individuals of mixed heritage were suitable for consideration as German citizens or should face deportation. During the same period, Konrad Lorenz, assigned as a military psychologist, worked with Hippias on the project, which later diminished the reputation of Lorenz, who sought to hide this relationship by omitting it from his official biography when he was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1973. Captured by Russian forces, Hippias reportedly died in a Soviet prison camp in 1945. Another psychologist who engaged in flagrant anti-Semitic activities is Frederick C. Thorne, who earned a Ph.D. in psychophysics and subsequently an M.D. degree. Described as impulsive and iconoclastic by Harris in 2009, Thorne founded the Journal of Clinical Psychology in an unsigned opening editorial proposed limiting the acceptance of Jewish applicants to clinical psychology graduate programs. A storm of public protest erupted, several editorial board members resigned, and Thorne unconvincingly attempted to deny responsibility for the editorial. Carl Rogers notably did not resign from the editorial board, asserting a wish to work from within, to no good effect and with no public statements in opposition. Again, this is from Harris in 2009. APA remained silent on the issue, but the Eastern Psychological Association, interestingly, under then-President E.G. Boring, took a clear stance in opposition. Between the 1920s and 1950, Boring wrote supportive letters of reference for Jewish students and colleagues that identified them as Jews, but assessed whether they showed, quote, objectionable traits, stereotypically attributed to Jews. For example, Boring wrote a letter in support of Kurt Levin, noting that Levin's personal charm mitigated the defect of Jewishness. Levin later wrote, history amply shows that, quote, good behavior on the part of the Jew is by no means an insurance against anti-Semitism. Raymond Cattell, another prominent psychologist, was an early supporter of National Socialism and an adherent of Nazi racial theories, which he continued to preach as part of the secular, quote, religion, unquote, he founded known as Beyondism, while simultaneously trying to obscure their origins until his death. Described as a neo-fascist contrivance, Cattell used Beyondism to promote ideas that he formulated within a demi-monde of radical eugenicists and racists. In 1938, he argued that the rise of the Axis powers, quote, should be welcomed as reassuring evidence that in spite of modern wealth and ease, we shall not be allowed to sink into stagnation or adopt foolish social practices in fatal detachment from the stream of evolution, end quote. He did eventually condemn the Holocaust as immoral, although he was primarily focused on the fact that Nazi atrocities made it more difficult for people, quote, to think objectively on the inheritance of individual differences in mental characteristics, end quote. He was reluctant to unequivocally condemn genocide, but he preferred what he called genosthenesia, or the, quote, phasing out of unfit racial and cultural groups, quote, by educational and birth control measures, end quote, as opposed to, quote, literally killing racial minorities off. In 1997, the APA selected Cattell, then age 92, to receive its Gold Medal Award for Life Achievement in the Psychological Science, citing his prodigious landmark contributions to psychology. In response to this announcement, several APA members and others protested. APA leaders were consumed about what to do in response. In a statement sent by fax, Dr. Cattell said that, quote, my views of eugenics have evolved over the years, end quote, and that he now believes in eugenics only on a voluntary basis. APA postponed the award, and in December 1997, Dr. Cattell wrote an open letter to the AP seeking to correct the misconceptions critics promulgated. He objected to the public examination of his personal beliefs, which he stated were controversial but not racial, in the context of a scientific work for which the award was bestowed. In order to put an end to this personal attack, particularly in the light of his failing health, he wrote a letter to the AP president declining the award and removing his name from consideration. Shortly afterwards, Dr. Cattell died. Today, it appears that the APA may be repeating history. The APA's perhaps unintended bias in favor of Palestinians and against Israelis was recently seen in a letter to the UN condemning the 2021 Gaza conflict as causing mental health problems towards Palestinian children in Gaza. It did not mention the parallel problems associated with terror attacks, including missiles sent from Gaza, raining down on Israeli children. APA has not taken a strong stand, and while not subscribing to the BDS movement, the APA has permitted negative comments by Arab student organizations to post unchecked allegations and biased facts on its listservs and its conferences and governance positions without rebuttal. In fact, although not historically proven, stories of tensions between the Arabs and Jews go way back to accounts in the Old Testament describing Abraham's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael, who separated their families due to conflicts. In the apocryphal account, Ishmael went on to form the Muslim religion while Isaac remained Jewish. Both groups claim birthrights to the land today that was once called Palestine, but was renamed Israel after the 1948 United Nations decision. There's archaeological evidence that shows Jews lived there prior to the advent of Christianity for over 4,000 years. The misperceptions that fuel the BDS movement and the recent wave of anti-Semitism on college campuses predate the field of psychology, but need to be connected to the ancient cultural, land, and political disputes. While the APA has issued a resolution condemning anti-Semitism as causing psychological harm to Jews, and the newly created EDI office asserts that it will seek to combat anti-Semitism as part of the office's mission, APA has not called out bias and hate against Jews, and has specifically rejected consultation efforts to be more inclusive in its apology statement. Further, APA has not called out ethnic anti-Semitism in recently published documents such as the EDI list of appropriate and inappropriate terminology from February of 2022. The underlying narrative uses common socially referenced racial categories such as white, black, Asian, and First Peoples. The authors acknowledge that this kind of categorization is artificial, based largely on skin color, and does not account for the great diversity of history, experience, and ways of being within each category. In the context of the review, white referred to people of European ancestry with a note that Southern and Eastern Europeans have been discriminated against and harmed by mainstream Western-oriented psychology. The ADL suggests that there are three major ways to take action against anti-Semitism. They include speak, share, and show. So 1, speak up and report on anti-Semitic bias or discriminatory incidents. 2, share facts about anti-Semitism and how such bias and hate impacts everyone. And 3, show strength and support to those affected. It is important to label incidents of bias, extremism, bigotry, or hate as anti-Semitism to the community as well as to an organization. Many anti-Semitic acts flow from unproven, disputed, or erroneous so-called facts. It is important to call out premature conclusions and send out strong reminders when such disputed or erroneous facts are stated. In order to do this, it is important to learn more about what an incident is addressing. This step includes educating ABA members and those in governance as to what constitutes anti-Semitism. Third, anti-Semitism hurts not only those who are the direct targets, but also other Jews who feel silenced and fear becoming the next target of those who hate them for being Jewish. Showing support to individuals in the community at large via public statements in all publications and communications will reduce the psychological harm to individuals. An example was given in a recent CNN documentary about anti-Semitism in which a young college student described being targeted as a Jew and forced out of a group against sexual harassment of which she was a founder. Those who forced her removal claimed that she supported Israel, and therefore she could no longer participate in a group that sought to protect marginalized groups who were under attack. That anti-Semitism is a concern on campuses was pointed out in 2005 by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. A survey by the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under the Law found that anti-Semitism remains pervasive on college campuses, causing Jewish students to feel unsafe, concerned about being verbally and physically attacked, and often hiding their Jewish identity. A recent Pew survey reported that younger people were more likely to be negatively impacted by anti-Semitism. Yet the APA, which has relationships with psychology departments on campuses, has not called out the damage from anti-Semitism, whereas it has called out racism against people of color. Albert Bandura, one of our giants in psychology, reminded us that, quote, morality is socially grounded, given the many psychosocial devices for disengaging moral self-sanctions. Societies cannot rely solely on individuals, however righteous their moral standards. So, what can we do at APA? We can form a committee on eliminating anti-Semitism within the EDI office to assure attention to collecting data on anti-Semitic incidents within APA and psychology, survey staff and membership about their experiences with anti-Semitism. We can embed updated educational training tools concerning anti-Semitism in the APA 2022 repository of EDI general racism, bias, and discrimination resources. We can teach about appropriate Jewish examples concerning the misuse of inclusive language and related guidelines. We can consult with Jewish APA members and culturally informed representatives. We can use educational resources to review advocacy initiatives pertaining to Judaism and anti-Semitism. We can monitor, call out, and promptly issue public statements when anti-Semitic actions occur, and in particular condemn violent acts. In addition, set goals and action plans to monitor proactive EDI deliverables in this regard as part of APA's standing nationally and internationally. We can provide education to APA staff, governance divisions, and state psychological associations on eradicating anti-Semitism, use webinars and fact sheets to correct misperceptions and misinformation. This is in line with APA's strategic goal to utilize psychology to make a positive impact on critical societal issues. Align with the ADL and other organizations actively dealing with anti-Semitism and its negative effects. Continue to condemn the BDS movement in universities and support Jewish psychology students who feel harassed just for being Jews. Publish psychological information on the negative impact of all discrimination and bias on all people, the victims, the perpetrators, and the bystanders. Denounce psychologists' historical support of eugenics and other forms of hateful bias against Jews. Develop an updated and timely resolution on anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish prejudice in the context of APA's EDI framework. The last resolution on anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish prejudice adopted by the APA Council of Representatives in August 2005 was amended in August 2007 is outdated. Thank you.